Hello, everybody. Hello, Kaylee. How are you?
Hello. Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. For all of our listeners out there, we're excited to announce. You may have noticed we're not really on social media all that much. We're not really active users of a lot of social media platforms. So we are actually launching a subscriber email list. That way you can stay in touch with us. We can stay in touch with you. We won't be like bogging down your emails with overcomplicated stuff. It's just like, hey, here's what we put out. We'd really appreciate if you guys could join that. That keeps us in touch with you when the algorithms aren't in our favor, which they probably never will be. So you'll find a link to that in the description. You'll find instructions or pathways to that on our website. Go ahead and check those out. We'd love for you guys to join us. Kaylee's helping me set all that stuff up. Anything you want to add about that process, Kaylee?
No, just excited for a way to be connected with you all.
That's right. We are learning everything from the ground up for how to do it all. So it's going to be super professional. Okay, well, let's jump right into our discussions. We are on week 4 of our Mark series. We're going to be going over Mark chapters 7 and 8. I think we've have, at least as of this moment, 30 or 40 people kind of joining along with us. I'm sure this is recorded. We'll have many people over the years. But if you are wondering, you can get your own printed copy free on our website and go through this study on with us. I think there's a huge value in you learning how to study the Bible in a way that brings so much of it to light. So while we're in the book of Mark, we're often referencing back to some of the Old Testament passages. So kicking it off in chapter 7, we have kind of a story with Jesus and the Pharisees again. We'll be getting into the Syrophoenician woman, feeding of the 4,000. So we got a few good stories today. And I was noticing just off the front end, I don't know if you noticed this, there seems to be a lot of things about bread, references to bread. It's like the huge chunk in the middle part of Mark is just about bread and leaven. And I don't know if that's something that you noticed or any other themes that you've been noticing.
Yeah, I did kind of notice that. And I feel like the resident bread expert, I've been in
Mm,
sourdough bread making
yes.
since 2020. And so I have come to the realization that bread is good if Jesus calls himself the bread of life. I don't
Mm,
know why we all think bread is so bad for us.
that's
So,
right. And you're sitting there with all the metaphors like you've got to crush the grains in Jesus's body, I'm sure you're
mhm.
well, very cool. Let's dive into chapter 7. Um, and why don't you recap kind of this first story for us? You can even read sections of it if you want, and then we'll kind of talk about it together and answer
Yeah.
some questions.
Yeah, so this first section comes with kind of a dispute with the Pharisees. The Pharisees came up and saw that the disciples were eating from unwashed hands, which I know in some households is unthinkable.
Hmm.
And so I don't think that was the case in our household growing up, but
I think they
in the
gave
Jewish,
up. I think they gave up by the end because there were times we were told to wash up.
yeah. So the Pharisees come and see the disciples eating with unwashed hands, and this would be breaking some of the laws that the Pharisees had set up.
Hmm.
Uh, and that had to do with, washing cups and pots and things before eating. And so the Pharisees asked Jesus, why does the disciples not follow these traditions that the elders have put together and eat with defiled hands? So he quotes Isaiah there saying, um, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. And then goes on to quote, you leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men.
Hmm.
Um, So then there's this kind of goes on to talk about other rules of Moses. One straight from the Ten Commandments, honor your father and mother, and how some of these rules that the Pharisees had created go against that commandment from God,
Hmm.
uh, to love your father and mother through some different. I think it was kind of like a pledge or like a I don't know what the right word.
Corbin.
Corbin.
Yeah. It's one of those
Yeah.
words that's only used this once. And so even though we kind of know what it means theoretically, they just leave that word because you just don't have enough contextual variances to kind of give a good translation of it.
Hmm. Yeah. And then I don't know if you want me to go to the next section. I feel
I
like
think
that was
that's
kind of
pretty good
related.
because we've already got kind of two, it's all the same story. We've
Hmm.
got what the elders were accusing Jesus and his disciples of. We have that response there, but then he kind of breaks off and shows other examples. So we kind of have two
Hmm.
things to tackle with this. So I think the best way to start is you mentioned that they're accusing his disciples of not cleaning or washing their hands. Did you look into sort of that process? Where are they coming up with that, and what did you look into for that? And then if not, I can share a little bit about what they're griping about.
Yeah, you could probably go deeper in it than
Okay.
I can. My general understanding is that they had created these rules about washing certain things, but it wasn't necessarily part of like the law that Moses originally had
Hmm.
created. So it's kind of extra things to, be extra righteous, extra good, stay within the boundaries. But maybe there's more to it that I'm not aware of.
Yeah, it's sort of, I think we had the breaking of the Sabbath laws. So we've already talked
Hmm.
about how the religious leader had all these rules set up around everything to make sure we didn't get even close to breaking the real rules. Um, this one's a little bit different because there is an actual rule that they're using as the basis, and it's found in Exodus 30, verses 17 through 21. We don't have to go read it, but it is essentially the ritual processes that Aaron and his sons, and so then therefore priests, would do before all of their ceremonial stuff.
Hmm.
So they took that. That's something God commanded to do, is this washing with a basin and the tools, I think it mentions there in Exodus. And then they've extrapolated that to, well, it's not just going to be the priests. We're going to extend that to everybody. And there's this little line when they come from the marketplace. So they kind of created this rule that if you're getting food or whatever, if you've been in the marketplace before you eat, you should do this cleansing ritual just on the off chance that you've touched something unclean. And there's some debate. So some people interpret the washing of items as the cooking utensils or washing of the hands as the hands. Some people would say that you would actually wash the food in case the food was in contact with something unclean. And when we say clean or unclean, we're not talking our century germ cleanliness. That's not what they're worried about. They're worried about the ritually clean part. Um, and so that's the accusation. And so they're taking something that was just meant for the high priest to kind of show the amount of respect and honor that you should have when entering and serving God, and just extrapolating that to everyone needs to do this all the time. And so, as we'll see here in a second, it's missing the heart of the law and it's just focusing on the ritual. Um, if you're one of our early listeners and you've printed off all the sheets and you read Isaiah 24 instead of Isaiah 29, I'll be correcting that on the sheet. You were probably confused, but what did you think about reading Isaiah 29? And
I
if you
should
gotta
go
flip
back and
back,
look.
okay,
I was
I'll
like, I
I'll,
read
sh-
this earlier in the week, so I need
I'll
to.
share while you refresh. I always love that we go back to the Old Testament stuff, but you read some of it, especially passages like this one where it's a woe to Jerusalem. I think it has a different name in the text, but it's about Jerusalem and it's got all these warnings and it's doom and gloom, and it's not the parts of the Bible that we love reading, and it's you kind of miss there's an underlying hope that's in there, but because you get so wrapped up in the doom and gloom, you sometimes miss it. So now that you've had a chance, what was your thoughts going back and reading this passage from Isaiah?
I'll be honest, sometimes I get confused with going back to the quotes from like the prophets because, they don't seem like they're directly
Hmm.
connected, or it's not like they're like, this is a prophecy about the Messiah. And then, like, a lot of times it's not like this.
Hmm.
And it seems like it's, they're talking about something else. And then
Hmm.
they're like using that quote in the New Testament. And it doesn't always feel like,
Well, and it's even more complicated because I took a second looking at this specific one. When
mm-hmm,
Jesus is quote unquote quoting them, he actually doesn't quote it. He kind of does a little paraphrase and interpretation mixed into it,
mm-hmm,
where he kind of adds a bit that you could kind of read and kind of get by reading the context, but he's adding in words for clarity. And so it opens this weird door of like, okay, well, Jesus knows the scripture, but like, okay, so then when we use the Old Testament passages, how do we do that? Can we do it like Jesus did? Um, but in this case, you can definitely see that he's connecting Jerusalem at the time of the fall and how they were behaving. And he's basically tying what the prophet was saying about the people then. He's basically saying, like, you guys are doing the same. So I don't think what he's saying is he's not saying, um, well, he does kind of say Isaiah prophesied correctly about you hypocrites. Oh, I guess the point I was about to say is I can't make. But he's kind of reading that prophecy of the leaders of Jerusalem at that time as still being the leaders of Jerusalem at this time.
mm-hmm.
And I can't really argue with Jesus. So,
Yeah.
um, but like I mentioned, the Isaiah passage, it spells doom and gloom for Jerusalem, and they did end up getting captured. But at the end, there's some passages about there'll be a remnant left. There's always a bit of hope that Jesus isn't done with them yet, even though that um, they've betrayed him. If you want more on that, go read Hosea. I mean, it gets real graphic and very visual on that relationship of Israel and God and betrayal. So cool.
Yeah. I mean, I really liked kind of the part that Jesus is really hitting at is um really hitting just at legalism of like, you guys are
Hmm.
creating all these rules, but your hearts are far from me.
Hmm.
Um, and that, we're kind like they're kind of following the letter of the law and not the intent behind it of,
Hmm.
you know, um, like I feel like with the Sabbath thing, they were so strict on these Sabbath rules that like it's not right to heal somebody on the Sabbath.
Right.
Like the heart for like loving others and your neighbor, and this one is like honoring your father and mother, but they create these rules that you can basically like commit your parents, what was intended for your parents'
Hmm.
care to the temple, and so that they're no longer taken care of, which is not honoring them. And so like the heart is just following rules without having a heart of like what was behind the rules.
Yeah. And I kind of dug into this whole principle of the Corban,
Hmm.
which is so the Pharisees could, culturally they were supposed to take care of their parents. So you think of a person that's in a Pharisee, he's got all this money, but it's all going to have to go to supporting his parents who are now retired. But that was kind of like the idea is like, hey, you are our retirement.
Hmm.
So he's going to sacrifice his money and hand it over to the treasury. It's all selfless, is the
Hmm.
appearance of it. And then, he's got to tell his dad, I can't, I promised it to the Lord. But if you think about what that probably gave him access to. It's like, oh, he just got bought himself an in with all the leaders, all the connections. Hey, this guy gave us money. So now he doesn't have money for his parents, but he sure has the connections and he now knows the people. He's going to be well off, even though on appearances, he gave everything away.
Mm-hmm.
But in the heart, there's this sort of, I'm paying into this system.
Mm-hmm.
I might be reading between the lines on that, but that's kind of how, with their heart being in the wrong place, you could easily see that being the case. And
Mm-hmm.
we later will read about different scenarios where we know there was some corruption going on. So, but just in case none of this was making sense, that's why we have the disciples around who go, what's going on? Explain this to us. So it's always very nice of them that they ask. And that's where we get the classic verses of it's not what goes into the mouth that makes you unclean, but what comes out. And we got a nice little, actually, it's not rare in this week's reading, but we got a little bit of a Mark commentary where he says, thus he declared all foods clean.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of Mark inserting a little snippet. What I find interesting about that little statement is that kind of dates like the earliest Mark could have been written to that meeting that you read about in Acts, where they had this whole discussion about
Mm-hmm.
and Peter bringing it up. So now you like read that and you're like, well, there you go. This is a clear reference to something else in Scripture,
Mm-hmm.
and it kind of puts like, okay, so that debate had been cleared by the time Mark was writing that, and he's just establishing, hey, here's another example of where all that decision came from.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of a cool little throw in right there.
Yeah. That section just reminds me, I don't even know where this verse is, so maybe this would be good to look it up. But like out of the heart, the mouth speaks. And so, it says it's not what comes in, but what comes out, because ultimately what's in our heart will eventually, come out
Mm-hmm.
in what we say and what we do. And I think I think that's interesting to me of just like it's, not just what comes out of your mouth, but really like the heart's intent.
Right. And you still see this. I don't listen to him much anymore, but I always really like listening to Dennis Prager. For those who aren't familiar, he's a Jewish political commentator. And he's written some good books and he has some great stuff. But he kind of has a mindset of like what goes on in your head isn't that big of a deal, and people shouldn't worry about it. So that's very different from the Christian view, which is like, nah, it starts there. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's where Jesus comes in and he reads the Old Testament commandment, don't murder. And he's using like he's reading the whole Bible and he goes, okay, well, what's under that? Well, you're
Mm-hmm.
not going to murder unless you are filled with hatred. So the real
Mm-hmm.
problem is don't hate. And so I love how Jesus kind of takes what would be all these laws and stories of the Old Testament unrelated to us now. And he challenges us to, hey, what's the underlying wisdom and truth here? And not what am I hoping to get out of it? What is like the
Mm-hmm.
Bible presenting as the truth? And then that's what we need to live by. So,
Maybe I'm just being like, I don't know if devil's advocate sounds like the right word, but um, the Pharisees were kind of taking the law and,
mhm.
buffering themselves. And that kind of sounds like what Jesus did right there of like the laws don't murder, but like you shouldn't even hate. Is it just different because yeah, he's God and so he has kind of the authority to
No, I do think that there is a difference, and it's fine to love that you're playing devil's advocate. So let's clarify it, and you let me know if I do a good job.
Mhm.
So the Pharisees are extending the law so that people will not be in danger of violating the law. Um,
More of like through just action stuff. They're
Action. Yep, not heart related.
yeah.
So if I'm trying to think of an example outside the ones that we've got, but so let's say don't eat unclean animals. Well, then I don't, is the law about pigs even being in the land of Israel? Is that a biblical law or is that a traditional law? I don't feel like there was a law that said pigs can't be in the land of Israel. I could be
Yeah,
wrong,
I'm not sure.
but there's an example where they said, oh, we can't eat pigs. Here's the law that we're going to make. Just don't have pigs around. And it doesn't like make you understand the purpose of the law. It just
Hmm.
makes sure that no one's going to mess it up. And then Jesus isn't trying to add additional rules. He's trying to help you see the heart of God. The heart of God is not to hate. And it's not coming from just reading one thing and just saying, well, this is what I think is under it. It's from understanding the whole scripture. So it's not like he's taking just that one statement and saying, I'm God, this is what's really under it. It's understanding the whole of scripture and
Hmm.
applying that wisdom to that spot. And you see this with Paul. My favorite verse is where Paul talks about the oxen that's threshing the wheat, and the law is don't cover its mouth, let it eat. And he
Hmm.
takes that law and he goes, hey, so if you got a pastor or somebody serving you, pay them. And he's taking that Jewish law and he's making it a moral case for paying your pastor or
Mm.
preacher or whoever is serving you. So that you have Jesus doing it, you have the apostles doing it, and that's what we need to do as Christians is not do a here's my thought, what are my verses that prove it. Let me keep studying and understanding this Bible so it shapes how I think and view the world. That's how I differentiate that.
Last question on this section.
Cool.
So obviously in like the law, we've talked about, you couldn't eat pigs. There's a whole list of what you could or couldn't eat. But then
Mm-hmm.
here, Jesus is now saying like any food is clean. Like, what's kind of the purpose behind that? Like, why would God give the Israelites these rules on what they like don't eat these things, and then Jesus come to say, okay, now they're fine.
Hmm. I have thoughts, but I think this is one of those areas where I bet some research would be better. So we're going to cast this question. And I think at the last episode, I said I was going to cast it at the end, but these are long episodes. So, and I'm sorry, I've got a hair stuck in my glasses. So I'll cast this into a midweek episode where I'll deep dive into that question. And let me see if I can restate the question with that distraction. The question is, what is the purpose of the eating laws about clean versus unclean animals? Like, what's the purpose of that?
Hmm.
Okay. And I will come back with some answers that are more than just thoughts I've had in my head, but not really verified by anything.
Hmm.
Cool. All right. This is the turning point in the book of Mark. Do you know why it's the turning point in the book of Mark?
For my reading, it's because it's the first time that Jesus extends to a Gentile.
Hmm. There might have been one other story, but this is like the first direct act
Mm.
that Jesus' ministry has turned from a Jewish only to Jewish and Gentile. He's not
Hmm.
just ignoring the Jews now, but he's now going to open that door. And this is a short enough passage. You summarize, so I'll read this passage and then we'll talk about this. This is a good one. He got up and departed from there to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it, but he could not escape notice. Instead, immediately after hearing about him, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she was asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, let the children be fed first, because it isn't right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. But she replied to him, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Then he told her, Because of this reply, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. When she went back to her home, she found her child laying on the bed, and the demon was gone. What have your thoughts about this passage been in the past, and what are your have you learned this time around? Has it changed anything?
Yeah, I had always liked this passage before. I was always like, as somebody who isn't Jewish, it feels like, you know, like nice to think that Jesus um came for us too, it just
Hmm.
primarily this Jewish religion and like now has extended to like all the nations. So I've always liked this passage. I know listening to a Bible thinker Q&A one time, I'd never thought of it like this, but one of
Hmm.
the questions was like, how rude of it for Jesus to call this lady a dog. And I never really thought of like, that being like derogatory in a
Hmm.
way. And like, I think he had a really good response if anybody wants to go look at his response to that. But um, yeah, I'd never really read it as like, oh, that's mean until that so that's kind of been like running in my head as I read that story because I
Yeah.
listened to that within the last couple of months.
And Bible Think is a great resource because
Mhm.
he has a clip search feature, so you can just search that and it'll take you right to the part of the specific video.
Yeah.
Um,
I've
so
used
there's,
that a lot when I've had random questions on
yeah,
things. I'm like, does he say anything about
yeah.
this? So he always has
And
good
that's
responses.
hopefully as you guys do these studies, you'll find that you get these are my resources that are trusted. I was using one, I don't think I've mentioned it on the podcast. Bible Ref is a good one. I like them because they will put whatever passage you have a question on. Here's all the different versions, and then they'll have their kind of referee, which is why they get the term, their synopsis of what their explanation for the passage is. But you can go and read all the different versions. Bible Thinker's answer, and I've researched this elsewhere. There's two different words for dog in the Greek, and he would have been speaking Greek to this woman because she wouldn't have known Aramaic. There's Kion, which would just be like a wild dog, but then there's Kainarion, which is like a puppy. So he was using the more friendly term with
Hmm.
her in that dialogue. So it definitely, when you read it in Greek, he's not being like, "You dog." It's more like, "Hey, you don't feed it to the puppies." He's in a way, most interpretations are like he's putting out a way for her to argue her point because he wants her to pursue that. Um, is how most interpretations will go with that.
Yeah.
So even though these stories are all happening like right after each other, this is actually spanning quite a time span because they're leaving from the Sea of Galilee. They've gone up to Tyre, which would have been a trek because Sea of Galilee, and then you've got to go north and west up to Tyre, which is on the Mediterranean coast. And then it gives a slight direction that they're going to go, uh, went by Sidon to the Sea of Galilee. So that means they went further north around a mountain range and back down to the Sea of Galilee. So this is a big trip. And sometimes when you're reading Mark, you get the impression that all these things are just happening. But he's taking in a pretty in order story, but he's definitely condensing, taking out parts, and just including the parts that create a narrative and a theme in the story. So it's always good just to keep that
Hmm.
in mind. And I always like maps. Go look up a map. People have drawn the little lines so they kind of know where
Hmm.
they're at. But
That was something I've done this time while reading Mark that I've never really done
mhm,
before. And I feel like it just adds like some like extra like context and things. You can kind of see like when he's leaving Israel and like
mhm,
that was something that stood out to me. I was like, oh, he's going like way up north there. Um, that's probably more like Gentile region. And you just kind of have a little bit more context instead of just
Yeah.
glimpsing over locations.
It, and as you start, always keep, you don't have to become a map expert, but as you read books of the Bible, the places are important. I think we kind of described at the start of Mark where he said, and people came from here, 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 and here. And if you're just like, don't know anything, you're like, oh, cool. And if you look at a map, you see, oh, these are all the different directions he's saying from all over. There's so much that they can do with locations, that it's important to kind of keep a mental tab in the back of your mind, like where these places are, what would I be thinking of when you say that. I've gotten so much out of doing that. And in our next
Shout
series,
out for your Acts study.
yes, that's
I
not going to be
think,
the next one, but yeah.
yeah, your Acts study does that a lot. And our church has been going through Acts, and I like didn't really quite understand what you were doing at first, but then
Mm-hmm.
our pastor kind of has done some similarity of in Acts, you see Paul and others go to these locations that
Mm-hmm.
these letters are written to, and you can get like almost a little bit more context to the letters
Yeah.
just from reading, in Acts. And so
Yep.
paying
Mm,
attention to where they are can help you with reading those letters to those locations.
exactly. So if you're wondering what Kaylee's list talking about, head to our website. That's actually one of my favorite series I've written is The Life and Letters of Paul. You're reading Acts and his letters at the same time. Most people don't know this, but in our Bible, all of Paul's letters, have I told you this? How are Paul's letters organized in the Bible?
Mm-mm.
Longest to shortest.
Oh, yeah.
So it's like there's no good reason that that's the only way to read them. So I just had the idea like, why don't I just rearrange them with the Book of Acts to make it make more sense? And as I went through my test study, it was just like all of Paul made so much more sense. But that's for another study. I was actually going to reference my other study, The Line of Jesus, which will be the start of the new year, is what we're going to do because it starts with Genesis. And there's a moment in that too where it's important to remember places because they're mentioning the place early in Genesis so that later on in the story you're like, oh, right.
Mm.
So those sorts of things happen a lot. Okay. We have this is the healing of. Why don't you read this one? This is a short one.
Then, this is starting in verse 31. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of Decapolis. And they brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment, and they begged him to lay his hands on him. And taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, touched his tongue. Then, and looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. And Jesus charged them to tell no one. But the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, He has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak.
Yep. So I think this is kind of a start of a theme about deaf and blind people that people are going to hear Jesus, they're going to see Jesus, and a contrast to not only the Pharisees, but even at
Hmm.
times the disciples, like they don't see him fully yet.
Hmm.
Um, so, but this is kind of a different miracle, and we'll hit another one here soon. So, what do you think about all the details about the process
Yeah.
of the healing?
I feel like we talked about this a little bit in one of our previous talks, and um, it seems kind of weird because he's
Hmm.
healed people with like just saying, You're healed,
Yeah.
or healed people like when he wasn't even there with them.
Hmm.
And so it just seems like interesting that he couldn't just be like, you're healed, but he's actually going to, you know,
Hmm.
put his fingers in his ears and touch his tongue and
Yeah.
spit on him. I think spit or just spit on him. I don't know. Um,
Spit
so
on
yeah,
his
interesting that
fingers,
he
I want
does.
to say. Yeah. And I think there's been some good explanations for this. It's not a, hey, Jesus has this three-step process to healing a deaf person. That's not the point. One of the clues comes in verse 32. They brought to him a deaf man, so it's not like the deaf man was searching out for Jesus. They kind of brought him to him. So you might read into this that maybe the deaf person was not believing, didn't have the faith. Um, that's not for certain. Um, and they had to beg Jesus. But anyways, so you got this deaf person. He probably doesn't know what's going on, doesn't know who Jesus is, but Jesus does a lot of visible stuff. The spitting, contact, a lot of things so that the guy knows like I am doing something. He's putting his hands in his ears so he knows like this is what I'm fixing. Fingers on
Hmm.
the tongue. And not only that, but we've talked about this before where it's like that would be considered like unclean. Maybe not like biblically unclean, but definitely like culturally, like don't do that.
Well,
And
I
he's
think it
going,
still seems
it's unclean
was
to
then
us
was.
for sure. That's why we should not
Yeah.
be doing this unless the Holy Spirit is guiding you to. Um,
Yeah, I think you mentioned this the other week. And just this is an interesting idea of how personable Jesus is, of,
mhm,
a deaf person, like if Jesus was just like, be healed, he's
mm,
deaf. Like obviously
yeah.
he could have heard, but like, getting to his like level of like physically doing stuff when he like wouldn't be able to like
Hmm.
hear him, I think is like really, interesting to think of Jesus in like that personal way.
Yeah. And you've gotten that with the woman with the bleeding problem calling her daughter. You got
Hmm.
that with the Syrophoenician where he's inviting her to challenge him. He's meeting people exactly where they are.
Hmm.
And I was thinking about this week. It was not directly related to this point, but just the idea that we cannot read part of the Bible and make that our one thing. Like, this is how I must treat everybody this one way. This
Hmm.
is how I live my life this way. There isn't a one way. It's like Jesus was harsh to some people and soft to others.
Hmm.
And that's my whole thing of like, let's just keep reading, keep understanding, and pray that God works our heart in the same
Hmm.
way that we treat others exactly the way that we need to. We're not going to get
Hmm.
it right, but I think that's what we're being called to as Christians is not a simple one path, but a
Hmm.
adaptive and thoughtful.
Should clarify one way to salvation,
Yes.
multiple ways to sh to
Share and
share that.
interact.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. All right. Feeding the thousands. Wait, didn't we do this story already? What's going
Mm.
on? So we don't need to read this story, this little passage, because it's same content as the previous feeding of the thousands. This one's just
Hmm.
4,000, and there's a different number of bread and fish, and they end up with a different number of bread and fish.
Hmm.
I don't think that there's really much into the numbers. Like we don't have to go crazy about 12 baskets, 7 baskets.
Hmm.
There might be something to it, but I think it's just there's just extra. I think it's the point.
Hmm.
So, one, before reading this week, in your mind, did you know that there was two separate feedings of the thousands that were very similar? And kind of why do you think this is included? What are your thoughts on that? And maybe even previous thoughts on it, but
Hmm. I did know there's two separate feedings. One of just the apologetics videos I watched years ago, you know, that was something that was brought up, that
mhm.
people who are disputing the Bible try to bring it up.
Yeah.
Um,
Which is a great,
and
I'll
so,
interrupt and let you go back, which is a great point for people who are attacking the Bible are often not giving any grace to it. So it's like Mark's a smart person. Like if he's putting two feeding of the thousands stories, like he's not dumb. He didn't forget he put it. Like
hmm
he's telling you this happened twice.
hmm
Like let's assume that he's correct. And so people who attack the Bible don't give it any grace and they assume that the writer and author is not competent. So if you run
hmm
into any of those, if you're listening to this and you've been a skeptic, just know that people don't give any grace to the Bible when they should. Continue.
hmm I would say before the study, I never really thought about like why would he include both stories. Um, in my reading, my study Bible said that this occurred in more of a Gentile region, and so I
Mhm.
wasn't sure if that was kind of why he included both. It was like one that was mostly a Jewish audience versus one that is now more likely included Gentiles.
Talking about how places are important, this happened in a more Gentile region. Where at? I think you might have to go back to verse 31.
The Decapolis, which we have read about before.
And what story?
Right. It was, he healed somebody there and told them, don't tell anybody.
Mm.
And then she like
That
went
was the
and,
one story he did tell him to go share with everybody.
oh,
It
yeah,
was
yeah,
the
yeah.
casting out the legion of demons and the pigs drowning themselves. Let's just go back to there. Oh, demons, chapter 5.
Yep.
The man begged him. Turn in my page.
Yeah. Verse
Um,
19.
Go home to your own people and report to them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. So he went out and to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus has done for him and how they were all amazed.
Mm.
And I think I made a comment, keep that in mind. And I just loved your face right there where you're like, that's right. We have read this. So that's exactly what these are for. So you've got all these excited Gentiles for Jesus, and there was no like previous statement for like, wait, why are all the people excited for Jesus? It's the Decapolis. They've heard about him from this guy, and now they're all excited. So,
Good thing he brought them bread since they don't have, any pork to eat.
right. We were because all the pigs. I'm like, yeah. Um, yeah. So those are sorts of you'll hear from the Bible Project, and I like the way they phrase it. The Bible is meditation literature. Not that you go, let my mind think of the thing. It's not about that. It's more you read it and you reread it and you're continually learning because you need to take things that you've learned later when you reread and see how much more you get out of it. So that's
hmm
a great example of maybe if you didn't get it on this go around because we pointed it out, but as you continue to read more, you're going to pick up on all this extra stuff, these clues and these little hints that the authors have left for us. And I just find that so neat. You'll
hmm
It's an endless depth of learning.
hmm
But yes, to your point, this is a Greek crowd. And so with Mark's way of providing commentary, the blessings and the overflowing gift of life is not going to be just for the Jews. It's for the Gentiles. And you can still tell that the disciples don't get it because there they are, exact same situation. We've got all these people. Let's send them home. And Jesus is like, what bread do you have? And it's like they're still not getting it. And I
hmm
you can just imagine their faces where they're like, wait, he's doing that for them? For them? You know, so cool.
That's a good point. I never that was one of my questions of why why are the disciples sitting there being like,
Hmm.
what are we gonna do? It's like you've obviously seen him do it before.
Hmm.
But when you the way that you phrase that brought to mind of if this is a Gentile audience and they they had ideas of what they thought the Messiah was going to be. They thought it was going to be, just like, for this, uh, for
He's the
Israel, like saving Israel.
Jewish Messiah,
Yeah,
right?
right. And so, of course, they're not thinking like, oh, he's going to do this bread miracle again for
Hmm.
these people.
Yeah.
That answered a lot because I was like, come on, you've seen him do it. Like,
Yeah.
why is this a surprise? Round two.
That the disciples are purposely portrayed kind of dumb. Maybe not that harsh, but they are purposely portrayed that way, which I think
Mm,
is one clue that this is not false. Like if the disciples wanted something written, they'd be like, "Ooh, and make me 3 inches taller."
hmm.
So that's one evidence for it
Yeah.
being
I mean, we
correct.
get to it later, but if
Mhm.
Peter is the source of this material, he's, very clearly not painting
Yeah,
himself in a great
yeah.
light.
But I do think some people get too harsh and they kind of miss what I just pointed out, which is that's actually natural and very human. That's to steal a phrase from 10-minute Bible Hour, Matt Whitman. He says like the human brain, we work in like this, the us are my group, and then there's the other group, the cultural other. And even though in America we pretend like, no, no, we accept everybody, it's really not. We still kind of more on, do you believe the things I believe? But at the
Hmm.
time, it was, this is our nationality, our clan, our group. And like, yeah, they could tolerate because they weren't in power other people, but it was like, you're not us. You get that with the Jews and the Samaritans.
Hmm.
So when you read this story, having that grace about how the disciples reacted to be like, hey, you and I would probably have done the same. So,
Hmm.
so there is a purpose to the feeding of the 4,000. It's not just to show Jesus can do it more than once. There's a lot more to it when you're reading it in context.
Hmm.
Next story is connected to this one, and we get some leaven discussion. Have I had you read something yet?
Hmm.
I will read this then. We are in chapter 8, verse 11. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, demanding of him a sign from heaven to test him. Sighing deeply in his spirit, he said, why does this generation demand a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation. Then he left them, got back into the boat, and went to the other side. The disciples had forgotten to take bread and only had one loaf with them in the boat. Then he gave them strict orders. Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. They were discussing among themselves that they did not have any bread. Aware of this, he said to them, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Don't you understand or comprehend? Do you have hardened hearts? Do you have eyes to see? Do you have ears and not hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets full of leftovers did you collect? 12, they told him. And when I broke 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many baskets full of pieces did you collect? 7, they said. And he said to them, don't you understand yet? And then it just moves on with that question hanging in the air.
I liked you had us go back and read in Matthew.
Hmm.
Um, and I like how it finishes that story by saying, and they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And I'm just imagining them being like, Jesus, we only have one piece of bread. Like, we didn't get any bread from the
Yeah.
Pharisees. Like, thinking, he was talking about like physical bread there. And so that was just comical to me. But
It's these guys were on way out of the league with Jesus. And so I'm just like I'm trying to put myself in their shoes of just like how difficult. it must be for every situation, at least how it's portrayed, is like
Hmm.
Jesus speaking in parables even to them. And they trying to figure out like is he being literal? Because sometimes he's very literal, but he exaggerates. And then sometimes it's parables and you're supposed to not take it serious. So
Hmm.
it's funny how they always are just like, what? Um, yeah, I think that one does pretty much explain itself. But verse 18, having this theme pop up more, and we're about to get it again. Do you have eyes and not see? And do you have ears and not hear? And that talks about hardened hearts. And I think you get that when the Pharisees come up to argue with him, and he just leaves. He's like,
Hmm.
"You're not getting a sign." And I think sometimes there's a moment to engage with people in a critical way, and sometimes you just look and you go, and I'm just no, you're just not getting it.
Mm.
Um, so
What do you feel like Jesus says, why does this generation seek a sign? Truly, I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. Is there like, you know, is it a future generation will receive signs? Was it a past generation that received signs? Or do you,
I think he's just pointing out to the leadership, like I am not going to be a little monkey and do the little dance.
hmm.
There have been miracles, and you guys have been witness to them.
Hmm.
So even if you come up and you say, "Show us a sign," and I do the sign, what are they going to do? Ask for another sign.
Hmm.
And so he's just saying, like, there's not going to be any more. I'm not going to do a miracle just to prove to you because it won't work because your hearts are hardened.
Hmm.
And then I don't know if it's in a different part of Mark or in another gospel, but you get um, except for the sign of Jonah, which was basically like, you're going to see me come back from the dead.
Hmm.
So, and I think he's right. Like, um, in my midweek bonus video, I think I talked about the hardening of hearts, how you have people like Pharaoh, where even though you're getting shown all this miraculous things, you harden your heart, or the kings of Israel when Elijah was called down fire from heaven, and they're like, "Yeah, we're still gonna kill you." It's just like at some point, somebody is just so hardened that you can't win them over, even with a
Hmm.
sign or a miracle. Or,
Yeah.
but that's different from how the disciples' hearts are hardened. It's not that they're not open to things; they just don't understand.
Hmm.
Why don't you read the healing of the blind man?
Yeah. Starting in verse 22. And they came to Bethesda, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village."
Always found this as a fascinating story,
Hmm.
and why the description of the tree, people like trees.
Yeah. I had the same question when I read it of like, it almost seems like Jesus was not successful in his first attempt at
Hmm.
healing. So it's like, oh, Jesus had to like double, like, have a second
Hmm.
attempt at it to see healing. Um, yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. My study Bible that I read, I thought had a good connection.
Well, let's
Uh,
hear your connection first, and then I have a few options that I'll talk about.
yeah. Well, I feel like we've been talking about this theme kept showing up of like, the Pharisees and even the disciples like had this blindness and this like
Mm,
deafness to what Jesus was teaching. And um that this healing was kind of, you think of the disciples, they were, they kind of understood who Jesus was, but they didn't
mm,
have like a full understanding.
hmm. Yeah, and I like that explanation. It even works well in the narrative
Hmm.
for you got the story, could be a hidden Markan sandwich. When I look up the Markan sandwiches, this one's not listed.
Hmm.
But like you got a story of the disciples like not getting it. Here's a story where a blind man kind of sees things before he then gets fully healed.
Hmm.
And then you get this passage of Peter where it seems like he gets it, but then not quite.
Hmm.
And so I think that is reading the text as plain as you can. The best interpretation that you can come away with is it's a kind of an alliteration or a connection to what the disciples are going through. They're kind of seeing Jesus. The Pharisees are just blind. The disciples are seeing people like trees. They're kind of getting
Hmm.
it. And then later, post resurrection, then they'll fully see. Um,
Although if this guy was blind, what would like how did he know what trees look like?
I mean, he wasn't blind afterwards. So he'd be like, they kind of look like,
Yeah.
I don't know. That's a good question.
But I don't know. I mean,
Well, not
maybe I'll have to ask
everybody's
my husband. He's
born.
pretty blind if people look like trees to him.
People aren't all born blind, so could have
Mm.
been damage that happened later.
No.
This is a good example. I'm going to share a few other possible ways of interpretation, but just because this is not a very clear, like, why did Mark write this? It's sometimes good just to read through a few different ideas and then kind of have like, I like this one. There's a few other ones that I would say are okay. And I can sit with, I don't need to know exactly why Mark had this because I don't think this is a passage that gets us super clear. But a few, um, here we go. One is it's a gradual process, a gradual healing in two steps to kind of foreshadow that Jesus's comings are in two steps, the first coming, the second coming. There's nothing else around the text um, that kind of indicates that it's about the first and second coming, but I've heard that one thrown out there. Um, you could look at the fact that he says people look like trees, and trees is used in the Old Testament to indicate like moment of decisions. You can think Abraham sitting under the tree, and then he has to help negotiate with the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. Moses in the burning bush. Noah. Why did I write Noah? Noah tree.
Didn't Jonah?
Jonah. I meant to write Jonah. I wrote Noah because I'm a great Bible nerd. Jonah, and I think it's called like a vine, but it'd be a tree, and he's having to make the decision of do I just trust God or do I lean on my own understanding of things?
Hmm.
So that could be a way that, okay, maybe I'm reading into the tree aspect that Mark is trying to get me to think about some Old Testament references. Or another way the tree is used as eternal life. So um, you could kind of go with some of those. I think how your Bible study, or your study Bible, indicated that connection to the disciples, I think is probably one of the better readings. And then I also do like um, the second coming of Jesus aspect of it too. But you don't have to have the answer.
Do you feel like this story, well, I guess like, you know, I don't know if you're at a church that has a like strong healing ministry, but for like
Mm.
any of these stories of Jesus healing, like do you feel like these stories should or shouldn't be used as like prescriptive methods of seeing
Hmm.
healings?
Yeah, I lean away from, because what you don't want to do is come away from the Bible with an idea of, if I do X, then Y, because then you're creating a false sense of expectation where there doesn't need to be. You get this throughout all of your scripture reading, and you use the word prescriptive. Is the passage being descriptive or prescriptive? If it's just being descriptive, it's just telling me what's happening. That doesn't mean I have to do it that way. So a
Hmm.
lot of Old Testament passages, you have a lot of the early um, Abraham, Jacob, all those guys had multiple wives. Oh, and so you got all this movement now of people using the Bible to talk about polygamy. Well, the Bible, they were polygamous. That's the Bible describing what was going on, not prescribing to do it. And then when you actually read it, it's like, oh, bad things happen when you have more than one wife. The
Hmm.
Bible is telling you don't have more than one wife.
Hmm.
So I think this is an example of, just because Jesus did this miracle this way this one time, we shouldn't follow that. I think if you're being led into a healing, the Spirit's going to indicate what you need to do. If you need to do anything at all, we have other healings examples where it's more about the faith of the person. So,
Hmm.
yeah, good question. And I haven't been keeping track of time this week. Yeah, let's kind of reach our closing up. We have story of Peter taking up the cross. It all kind of blends into one final story. Peter looking good, calls Jesus the Messiah. Uh, it doesn't say it in this one, but this is where kind of Jesus gets called the Rock, the founder of the church, leader of the church. But then Peter turns right around and he gets told, "Get behind me, Satan." So it's like, yeah, Peter was the source of this material, and he's making things up. He wouldn't include that.
Hmm.
And then a call for us to take up our cross in the same way that Jesus is heading to the cross.
Yeah. Something my study Bible pointed out that I didn't really know is that in Mark, there's three different times that Jesus predicts his death. And each of those kind of have a similar format of like Jesus predicts his death. The disciples don't really understand it. And then Jesus gives like guidance on like discipleship.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that's an interesting thing. I'm excited to like see those
Because
occurrences.
they're all coming up from this point on.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So this is the first one.
Okay. Yep. So we've already had the turning point for, this is not just for Jews, but this is also for Gentiles. And now this is the turning point for, if you watched the Bible Project's video on Mark, we're starting our journey towards Jerusalem. Um, so you'll have a lot of stories about the journey, and then you'll have stories at Jerusalem. So, well, I think the best way to end it will be just to read this last little spot, starting in verse 34. It's a good little section for a Christian to read and meditate on. So here we go. Calling the crowd along with his disciples, he said to them, "If anyone wants to follow after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life because of me and the gospel will save it. For what does it benefit someone to gain the whole world and yet lose his life? What can anyone give in exchange for his life? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father and with the holy angels. Amen.
Amen.
I don't have any thoughts on that. It was a good, I think Jesus said it best.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
My one question I had on this one was he says, take up his cross and follow him. Would they have an understanding of what that meant at this point, or is that kind of Jesus saying something to prepare them for?
They'd probably be sitting there going, oh, this is another parable.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think any of them would actually see him carrying a cross. But I think, later on, as Peter's sharing all this details with Mark, he's like, it all makes sense now. This is what he told
Mm-hmm.
us. It's like, oh, of course, after the fact, you can just picture them all going, oh, it was right there, guys. So very cool. I was just captured this week by how each time I start my reading, I'm like, I feel like it's just going to kind of be like, oh, the fun part. Oh, our Markin sandwiches. Oh, I like this story. But then each time it's like, oh, it just got better. Each time,
Mm-hmm.
like it just keeps getting better. And uh, we're definitely getting closer towards the end than the beginning. And the end is so good. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
things I'm looking forward to talking about. Um, let's end with every week. I end with either a way to help out with your studies, or the other passion of mine is how to better lead small groups or discussions if you're somebody involved in that. And I wanted to share a good small group strategy that should help if you struggle with, if you feel like you're doing all the talking. And we've shared in the past some other things with that, and that it's when you're leading a group, it's not about what you can share with the group. You want the group to do the learning, the processing, and the sharing. And so I know on this podcast, I do a lot of talking because there's two of us, but I invite Kaylee to do a lot of sharing. But in a group setting, so when I have my small groups, the way that I keep myself from making it about me is I do have all the stuff, all my notes. I know things I want to share about is I kind of have a soft rule. It's not a firm rule, but when I want to share, I need to be reflective and comment or make a connection between what people are saying. So I might be like, I really liked what you said about rephrase their thing. And it made me also think, and now I can share my thing. So that way people know like I'm engaging with you, I'm hearing what you say, here's a thought.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's even better is I don't even share my thought. I just connected. And you said this, which I thought that's your role as a group leader. This is also a great way to do transitions. Like you feel like, okay, I'm ready to move on. I really like what you said about this. And don't lie, and it kind of connects to you. And now you're sharing something that moves you into the next section. It's being wise. So,
This is a good tip for more than just small groups. I'm in a marriage class with my husband,
mhm.
and this is one of the things that we've learned is repeating what they say back
Yep.
so that you make sure you understand them, and then like adding your clarification.
Yeah. I know that
So,
is a useful strategy in our marriage because what's understood in my head isn't understood in her head and vice versa.
hmm
So there you go. Now we're giving marriage advice. Us experts of many, many
Right,
years.
right. That's when we invite our parents on.
Hear that, mom and dad? You'll be getting an advice soon. Alrighty, everybody. I hope your studies are going well. Looking forward to finishing off the second half of the Mark study. Halfway done. Woo! And don't forget to like, comment, subscribe to our newsletter. All right, we'll be seeing you guys later. Bye.